So I've been in this shop for a while now, and I've determined where I want to leave most of my machines on a permanent basis. I want to keep everything semi-mobile in case I have to move it around, but I also want to get dust collection over to these machines here on this side of the shop in a more permanent setup. I've been running this 50-foot long flexible 4-inch hose to each machine and just moving it as I go, but this creates a problem as it's kind of a tripping hazard and I'm always running into it. Additionally, these hoses wear out kind of quick when you're always accidentally stepping on them, and they're not that efficient for moving air because of all the ribs inside. To get it up and out of the way, I want to run some rigid ducting up the wall and along the ceiling to bridge the gap of the shop and then bring it down on the other side. Then I'll run a shorter section of hose that I can move between the machines on this side of the shop. Part of the reason the dust collector lives right here is because right there is a dedicated 220 circuit. This is a fairly powerful dust collector, so I'm going to stick with a 4-inch duct, even though a 6-inch duct would be better because it would move more cubic feet per minute. I considered trying to run a 6-inch duct, but that would have required me to replace this plenum here. I'll be running the duct along this string line, which is directly underneath one of the roof trusses. The trusses themselves are engineered to support up to 150 pounds, so I think it'll be okay with the lightweight duct that I'm going to be using. Then the duct will drop vertically between the window and the mini split, and unfortunately the roof trusses don't line up with the wall studs, so on this wall I'm going to have to use some drywall fasteners. I'll show you how I do this later in the video, but again the duct is pretty light, so I think it's all going to be alright. I'm going to be using PVC drain pipe, and this is pretty easy to get at any big box store. So there's a big debate over the suitability of using PVC pipe because there is a theoretical possibility that the static electricity produced by the air moving through could spark and ignite the dust that's in the duct itself, causing a dust explosion. Metal ducting doesn't have this problem because it can be very easily grounded. PVC is a resistor, so it's impossible to properly ground it, but I'm going to show some techniques that I use to try and mitigate the danger. I want to add though that the risk of a dust explosion in a home woodworking shop is about as close to zero as you can get, so I really wouldn't worry about doing this too much unless you're particularly paranoid. I designed this clamp that I'd use to hold the duct to the ceiling and walls. I needed to make about 11 of these clamps, so I started by laser cutting some thin templates out of 1/4-inch plywood. My laser can really only efficiently cut up to about 1/4-inch plywood, and I wanted to be able to use these templates multiple times, so I transferred them onto some 1/2-inch thick plywood. I'm very wary of using a flush trim bit on a router table with pieces this small, so I was pretty fastidious about always using the push blocks to hold everything down. With the final templates made, I was able to start tracing the shapes onto some 3/4-inch plywood that I'd be using for making the actual brackets. Making the brackets got pretty repetitive, but I wanted them to look nice, to be functional, and to use up some scrap plywood that I had. The first set that I made, I still used the double-sided tape to hold everything down, but after that I started just using screws because I didn't need to be too precious about this. I put an 1/8 inch round over on all the exposed edges just to make it look a little bit nicer and clean it up. I had to clean up some of the interior corners with the bandsaw. A little bit of glue and brad nails held everything together. The ducting really is quite light, so this was enough. If it had been heavier, I probably would have used a screw. So this right here was the prototype, and it turned out that no design changes were required, but I still needed to make 10 more of these. So one thing about this drain pipe is it rolls around, and when you're actually working on it, that's kind of a pain in the butt. So I whipped these up, and the reason I did this is because I'm actually going to attempt to ground PVC pipe, which is a fool's errand. The problem with trying to ground PVC pipe is because it's an insulator, so electricity isn't going to pass from the inside where the problem is to the outside very easily. Simply wrapping copper wire around the outside of the pipe won't really help with the static electricity that's on the inside, and you don't want to have anything really obstructing flow because if chips start collecting on it, it'll create a blockage and then your dust collection system's not doing anything. My solution is to use this self-adhesive copper tape. It won't obstruct airflow and it will offer a ground on the inside of the pipe. Please understand though, I think what I'm doing here is pretty unnecessary. This is maybe 10% better safe than sorry, but 90% I just wanted to see if my ideas would work. Anyway, I really made sure that the tape was well stuck down to the PVC because I didn't want it to come off during operation and then mess up the impeller on my dust collector. The tape itself, though, is really thin and very delicate, so I don't think it would do much damage. The ground for the tape is connected to the outside of the pipe via that screw and then the wire connector with the braided copper wire. I left that long tail on it because each one of these sections of pipe was built up individually and I wanted to be able to connect them to get a continuous ground running all the way back to the dust collector. This end will be connected to the next section of pipe when I put them all together. I wrapped the outside of the pipe in the copper wire, and from what I've read, they say to have one wrap per foot. I did not do quite that many. It's my opinion that if this duct is actually statically grounded, it's going to be because of the copper tape on the inside and not so much the wire wrapped around the outside. Here you can see how the grounding wires attach to each other at the joints. I needed to make sure that the center section of pipe was the perfect length. The length was 29 feet and half an inch, and I did measure this at the ceiling too, but that was harder to film. I also needed to account for about 2 inches that I'd lose for the thickness of the clamps on the walls. I set the pipes up like this so I could figure out where I would need to cut. Just about perfect. So with that duct done, it was basically just sitting in the way till I was ready to hang it up. The next thing I did was attach the brackets to the ceiling. I wanted to be able to temporarily hold up some sections of ductwork so I'd be able to line up the pieces that would go on the wall in the correct position. I ended up putting 6 brackets on the ceiling, 2 for each 10-foot section of duct. On the wall next to the dust collector, I was able to put 2 brackets directly into studs because it didn't have to line up directly with that overhead pipe. 90-degree bends are never preferable, but these were the most gently curving elbows I could find. On the wall by the mini split where the duct is going to come down, I didn't have a stud directly in line with the overhead duct, so I had to use these drywall fasteners. I'm not thrilled with using these, but each of them are able to theoretically hold something like 50 pounds, and I have a total of 6 on this section of duct. If it ever becomes a problem, I'll make some new brackets that are wide enough to reach the studs. I put a little double-sided tape in the vertical bracket so the pipe wouldn't slip down. I wanted to add a short section of clear tubing just to see what was moving through there, but the tubing that I got was way narrower than the PVC pipe was. I didn't really want to use this boot because it created this lip on the inside that I think would fill up and start creating a blockage. I thought about 3D printing an adapter, but that's not really accessible to most people, so here's another way to do this. I superglued a strip of PVC that I had cut off of one of the scraps onto the clear plastic tube to make kind of a spacer to fill the gap. Now it was slightly too big, but that's a much easier problem to deal with. I sanded a bevel onto the clear tube side, and then I heated up the part that's going to go onto that. PVC softens at a relatively low temperature, so this did not take long at all. I didn't want debris to get caught into the little gap that bevel would have created, so I sanded it off. Then I used a file to make a bevel on the inside of the tube to make sure that the airflow would be more streamlined. Will this matter in the grand scheme of things? Probably not, but it certainly won't hurt. I epoxied the two pieces together with a big gob to fill in that gap in my spacer. A short section of scrap flexible hose went onto the dust collector to connect everything all together. I've tested it, and this dust collector will pull enough air through all three if they're open at once to be useful, but it's much more efficient if you only use one at a time. On the other end, where I'm going to have a flexible hose to attach to the machines, I had the exact opposite problem that I did on the dust collector side. Luckily I had this little elbow that would work for the tubing, but it was still too narrow for the PVC duct. Of course that issue was pretty easily remedied. This end is probably going to be changed in the future to add a little bit more of a manifold on that wall of the shop, so I just attached that elbow with some pipe clamps. I needed to enlist the help of a good friend to be able to get the whole thing up, because it would have just been too awkward to do by myself. With the two of us, the installation went really smoothly. And yeah, I know I probably shouldn't be standing on my table saw wings. The vertical pieces went in pretty well, though I did remove some of the double-sided tape because it made the fit just a little bit too tight. I connected the grounding wires at all the corners, and then I sealed the elbows with just a very thin fillet of RTV sealant. I want these to be fairly easy to remove if I ever make any changes in the future. I cleaned off the paint around one of the screw holes on the dust collector for the grounding wire to attach to. Now the majority of the ducting, minus the flexible tube on one end and all the corners, is grounded to the dust collector itself, which is grounded to the electrical system. And the foam seal on that plenum was kind of worn out, so I did seal the joint up with some tape. I connected my ductwork to that ground wire using some wing nuts, so if I ever want to move the dust collector out of the way for cleaning, it's pretty easy to disconnect it from the ducts. So here you can see how this works. Single tube, connect to the joiner, the larger bandsaw, the smaller bandsaw, and the planer. Of course, now I had to see how well it actually worked. The planer puts out the largest volume of chips, so I started by checking that. Both the planer and the joiner have helical cutting heads, so the chips are relatively small compared to straight knives. In fact, they're so small that sticking in this clear section was probably a waste of time and money. Whatever, it looks cool even if I have to put something black behind it to actually see the sawdust going through the tube. As with the planer, I didn't have any issues with the dust collection on the big bandsaw or the joiner. To see how this would work with really fine dust, I connected it to the drum sander, and again, no issues at all, it worked perfectly. The smaller bandsaw was never actually designed for dust collection, but the small homemade adapter that's fitted to it still worked just as good as it did before when I was using the long duct. Having a hose over on this side of the shop really helps for cleanup. I decided I needed to do one more thing, so I made this little bracket to hang the end of the hose on when it wasn't in use. So anyway, that's how I did my dust collector ducting. And if you were wondering what that winch was for, here's what I do with it. As always, if you made it this far into the video, thanks for watching.